Hello, everybody, and welcome to Higher Ground. Good Monday morning to you. So glad to have you aboard. My name is Chris Hardwick, and we are broadcasting from our cleft in the rock in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina. Well, hey, it's Monday for sure, and we've been talking about the windows of heaven. We spent all last week talking about the windows of heaven, and we're going to pick it up here today. And just as a brief little summary, the windows of heaven is mentioned in Malachi, where God says if you bring the tithes into the storehouse, that he will open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that you couldn't even contain. He also said he'd rebuke the devourer. And so we talked about that. And listen, the windows of heaven is revelation. It is a word in season when God shows you something in the future, and it has to do with your provision or your inheritance. And then we've seen the first place tithe that's mentioned in the Bible is back in Genesis, where Abraham was coming back from someplace, and he met the king of Salem, which is Melchizedek, along the way, and Melchizedek blessed him, and it says Abram gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And now that's important, because the very next chapter of Genesis 15, and you can read that for yourself. I can't read all the scriptures every time we get together, so you got to read that for yourself. But Genesis 15, it talks about the reward that God began to give him. He took him outside and showed him the stars of the heaven in a vision, and said, your reward is going to be, these descendants are going to come from your own body, and they'll be as the stars of the sky. Well, it's really almost impossible, but think about this, as we, talked about this last week. Abram made a lot of mistakes. Abram and Sarah made quite a few mistakes on the promises, but the one main one is when Ishmael was born. That was something that was born from the flesh and not from the spirit. Now that's important, because when God promises you something, he will make it come to pass. And you just need to endure the contradiction and wait through what God has promised you. Remember, your hope is always in the future. He knows the plans that he has for you to give you a hope and a future. So this revelation, this opening of the windows of heaven, may pertain to a provision or an inheritance. And in Abraham's case, it was an inheritance, but he had to endure the contradiction from the time that the promise was given to the time that Abram and Sarah, they were like 100 years old, when in the natural, from the natural fleshly standpoint, their days were over as far as childbearing years. But God, who is the God of impossible, when he promises something, he has a timing with this. But remember this, when Isaac was born, and then 16 years later, approximately, God asked Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain and sacrifice him. Now, Abraham knew and had already settled in his heart that even if God had to raise Isaac from the dead, that this promise would be fulfilled. So he believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. And that's what we're expected to do. We're expected to believe that when God says a promise, gives us a promise, like he said, bring your tithes into the storehouse. And he says, test me in this and see if I won't pour out a blessing that you can't even contain. And then Abraham gives that offering, that tithe, that tenth, to Melchizedek. In the very next chapter, the Lord promises him an inheritance, gives him a reward. And so Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to righteousness. And then we talked about last week about Elisha, and how Elisha, it was so bad. The enemies had prevailed so much to the people of God, and that famine and all of that was in the land, but also the army was holding up the provision. The enemy army, I'm talking about, holding up the provision. Well, it says it was so bad that some of the mothers were boiling their own children to eat. That's bad. That's a bad circumstance. I don't know what your circumstance is, but I guarantee it's not that bad. And then, of course, Elisha prophesies to the king and says, by tomorrow, that, that wheat will be sold for such and such. And of course, the king said, well, even if God would open the windows of heaven, how can that be? And Elisha told him, well, it's going to be, but you won't see it. Okay. And then, of course, we know what happened with those fellas that were, had leprosy. They were going to die. And they decided, well, we can die sitting by the tree, or we can die going into the city, but why don't we just go into the enemy's camp? Perhaps they'll give us something to eat, but if they kill us, hey, we're even going to be better off that way. So they went to the enemy's camp, and the enemy had fled for their lives because God himself intervened and made a commotion and a racket to where this enemy took off for their lives, thinking the armies of that God or the armies of Israel were coming after them. So they left. And of course, these guys with the leprosy that, were going to die anyway, they started taking the provision that these enemies had left behind, and they brought it back and they hid it. And then they went back and got some more, and they said, perhaps we need to tell, unless we fall under judgment, we need to tell the king. So he went to the king's house. King didn't believe him, and they sent a scouting party out. The king actually said, well, they're just tricking you. That's a cheap trick. So, but it wasn't a cheap trick. These armies had fled for their life. The provision was there. And when they came back to tell the king, the king lost his life because the people themselves trampled him in the process. Now, we want to, in the few minutes that I've got left on this broadcast, I want to just maybe get into this. But we're going to talk about Elijah now and another instance of the windows of heaven opening up and a provision coming forth. Just like God promised. Now remember, God gives you the ability to see into the spiritual realm. We can see and we can hear. And I decree that and I declare that. So at the reading of this word, let a door and a window open over you so that you receive this revelation of the windows of heaven. Now, verse 17 of 1 Kings, that's where we're going. It says, now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there will be neither dew nor rain these years except for by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him and saying, go away from here, turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of Jordan, and it shall be that you will drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to provide you there. Now, God opens the windows of heaven, gives Elijah, who had prophesied a drought, a revelation concerning where he would find provision. Now, this is important, because the windows of heaven is mainly about revelation, about God giving you an understanding, and then he gives you a wisdom as to what to do with that understanding. Okay, so he said, go to the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. It shall be that you will drink of the brook that I've commanded the ravens to provide for you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, which is east of Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook. And it happened that while he was there, that the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. Now there comes a time where when God gives you a word and he gives you provision, then there becomes a time, and you can see it coming. So the brook dried up, and the raven eventually stopped coming, meaning that there was time now for another provisional revelation coming forth. And we are out of time for this broadcast. We are going to pick it up tomorrow on tomorrow's broadcast, talking about the windows of heaven. You go out and make this a great Monday, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow on Tuesday. God bless you. Bye-bye.